Okay, I am waiting for Facebook to connect. I think I'm almost there. It appears that YouTube is already live. If for whatever reason you are unable to find me on Facebook, I also broadcast this simultaneously to YouTube. And if you were to search for Dabble On at YouTube, you'd find my channel. I should have a better way for you to connect there. But it appears that I'm not showing up on Facebook. I'm getting the sending data sign, but no evidence that that data is actually arriving. Okay. Well, I think I might just go ahead and get started, and if for some reason this doesn't end up making it to Facebook, I will, let's see. If this does not end up making it to Facebook, I will upload it after the fact. All right. Let's see. Fill source. There we go. Okay. Let's go here. Whoop, to here. Got it. All right. I think I'm good to go. Hopefully, this will end up connecting with Facebook. Let's go back and see if I'm there yet. It still says sending data. I don't know what's going on with you, Facebook. Okay. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to Facebook is not cooperating. Find the critique at YouTube here. All right. Well, maybe that is all. Maybe that is what we're gonna all we're gonna get for today. All right. So I have some images that I'm going to critique today. And before I get to that, I wanted to let you all know that I have officially launched. I have officially launched a new podcast. I'm continuing my other podcast, which I've been doing for a couple of years now, Room in the Trees. You can find episodes of that at roominthetrees.com. Or if you subscribe, or you can subscribe on iTunes or any other podcast application. My new podcast is called Dabble Podcast. It was going to be Raw Materials, but I I don't know how I missed it, but SF MoMA has a podcast called Raw Material. So I decided to change it to Dabble Podcast, which I suppose makes sense because my website is dabbleon.com. So you can get the Dabble Podcast at dabbleon.com. That's dabbleon.com/podcast. That's dabbleon.com/podcast. It's called just Dabble Podcast. You should be able to find it in iTunes as well, but I've been having some problems with the iTunes directory. I don't know why. I just am. So you should be able to find that. Hopefully those issues with the iTunes directory will get sorted out. So if you are unable to download episodes from iTunes, keep checking back for the next week or so. I'll hopefully have a more concrete news for you next week. But in the meantime, if you cannot find me on iTunes, you can go directly to the website, dabbleon.com/podcast. And I will also try to remember to put a link there of my RSS feed, which if you know what that means and you know how to do it, you can subscribe to a podcast directly without using iTunes, using the RSS feed. So I'll post that as well. The podcast is awesome. I've recorded 3 episodes so far, and basically what it is they are conversations with artists about the materials they use. So it is about materials. That's kind of the focus. That's the question that I'm seeking after. How and why do artists use the materials that they use? How does that affect their creative process? Why are they attracted to some materials over others, and just techniques as well, how they're using them. I think you'll really enjoy it. I've had a lot of fun recording the episodes, and I'm really excited about this as a topic, exploring art making and exploring or conversations with artists through that lens, through the lens of materials. So this is the Thursday live critique broadcast. Just for anybody that might be coming upon this for the first time, I show up on Thursday at 11 a.m. Los Angeles time, and I will critique any images that are sent to me, any artwork that's sent to me. If you would like me to critique your work, you can send images to me at dabbleon@gmail.com. That's DABBLEON @gmail.com. And you can send any images. If you want me to talk about something in particular, make sure you make a note of that in your email. Or if you just want me to respond, want somebody else's feedback to get an idea of how your work is working or not working, that's fine too. Just send me images and I'll be happy to talk about them and critique them. If you send me images from your computer or from your phone, if you're on an iPhone or a Mac, that's what I'm most familiar with. In the email, somewhere in the email, usually in the top right-hand corner of the email window, when you send images, there's an option to send it as a small, medium, large, or actual size image. Right? There's a little drop-down menu. Usually it defaults to small or medium, depending. if you send me images, make sure you select the actual size. If you're doing it on an iPhone and you hit send, I think when you add an image, or either when you add it or when you hit send, it will ask you if you want small, medium, large, or actual size. Just make sure you always send me actual size so I get high resolution images. If you send them to me small, then sometimes they show up and they're a little bit low resolution. It makes it more difficult to see what's going on, and especially when they're blown up large on a screen like what I'm about to do. So today I've got a couple images from a good friend and somebody who's taken my classes before. And I think I'll just jump right into them. I'm going to switch over. Oh, I have been doing all of this talking with her image already up on the screen. So I'll just go back. I'll just go back to where I was. So let's go and take a look at these two images. I've got two images that I'm going to be talking about today, just here in Photoshop. I tried using iPad last week, and actually there are some things about it that worked really well, and I probably will do that again in the future. But today I'm just using Photoshop on my computer with a Wacom tablet. There are some advantages in terms of what I can show you, so that's why I'm doing this. Okay, so I've got two images. I've got this one of waves under a pier, and I've got this one which is a bridge coming down the bluffs. I don't know if this is Malibu, Santa Monica. I assume somewhere along the Pacific Coast Highway, but it looks like this footbridge coming down across the freeway or highway, and it's this really cool kind of swooping arched shape going down there. And both of these are watercolor. So I'm going to give the disclaimer that I am not an expert in watercolor. I've used it. I've spent many hours using watercolor, and I've nothing against watercolor. It is not my favorite medium for a variety of reasons. It's hard. It's difficult to use watercolor. And it's also just a different mindset. With watercolor, you are using the white of the paper as your lightest value, right? There are opaque watercolors called gouache that you can use to reintroduce white into a watercolor painting, but they are transparent paints, so you allow the white of the paper to come through those transparent layers, and that's what gives your paint lighter values. And then for white, you don't use white paint, you just leave the paper bare without any paint. That's a very different approach than what you would do typically with oil or acrylic. Oftentimes with oil and acrylic, you start with a toned canvas, like a burnt sienna or some kind of mid-value neutral, and you're working from the middle of the value scale out to the lightest and the darkest. So you're working from the middle out in terms of value, or light and dark. So there are some reasons that is actually a little bit easier, in my opinion. And I'm going to go back to, I'm just going to check in real quick on Facebook to see if I've showed up yet, and I still have not shown up. All right. Well, let's hope some of you found me on YouTube. Okay, so I need to give that disclaimer that I am not, I don't work primarily in watercolor and find it a little bit more difficult. But I thought this kind of explanation of the differences of our approach, specifically about having to use the white of the paper when you're painting with watercolor, was important, because that is the root of one of the most difficult parts of working in watercolor, and that is getting a full spectrum of value. Because you rely on the white of the paper, you have to be careful not to go too dark too quickly, because it's much lighter, it's much more difficult to pull the paint off without damaging the paper or getting it to pill up, or maybe the paper's too stained to be able to remove it back to white. So you tend to be a little bit more tentative in adding darker colors or mid-value colors, right? So watercolor paintings often make the mistake of existing too, generally the painting is too much in the lighter values and not enough midtones. And it can be difficult to get a full spectrum of midtones. So let me give you a more concrete depiction of that idea. So let's go to this one. Let's start with this one. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up this histogram, and charts are never super interesting, but hopefully this will be somewhat informative. So let's look at this histogram. I'm going to explain it a little bit because I think it might shed some light on this. So what we have in this, it's basically a bar chart. This side is black, or represents the darkest values, and then it is a full spectrum to midtones. This is mid-gray, and then white is on this side. And basically what this big white shape represents is a bar chart. So remember a bar chart, the taller the line is, the more of that value that exists in this painting, right? So you can see that right here at the extreme dark, at black, there is no white lines, right? It's gone. It tapers off until at black there is almost nothing, right? And then as we get down towards mid-gray, still pretty dark, but not near black, then we get this peak, which is probably these dark greens in the mountain. And then we get a dip in the midtones, and then we get another peak up at the lighter end of the value spectrum, right? This really high peak. So really the midtones and dark areas of this value spectrum are very much underrepresented. Typically, and again, it's going to depend on the scene, it's going to depend on the kind of painting, it's going to depend on how much light. If you're painting a picture of a white box on a white background, then it would make sense that the majority of your information or your value along this spectrum would be at the lighter end of the spectrum. But typically speaking, on an average day, an average landscape, we'd see a much gentler slope between highlights and shadows. If we took just an average photograph, for example, there would be perhaps a much more even distribution of values throughout. Maybe there would be a slight peak on the highlights and dark end, but you'd get much less of a dip in the midtones. Okay, so I think this is significant. This is a really important thing to understand about watercolor, that you have to work harder to get more gradual and evenly distributed values. And again, this is not color, this is value. Value is one aspect of color, right? It's how light and dark it is. Okay, so while I still have these levels open, this histogram, what I can do is I can drag this little black triangle here, and I'm going to do an extreme version. I'm going to drag it all the way over, and you can see how that just crunches everything down to black. What I'm doing when I drag this over is I'm saying I want to make this, which is currently a lighter value, kind of a dark gray, not completely black. I want to make that black, and then adjust everything else in the painting accordingly. So you can see when I move this little triangle over, the areas, these darkest areas, now go to be almost black, right? And all the midtones kind of scoot over to kind of expand that out into the full spectrum of completely light, completely dark. Okay, so if I turn this preview off, you can see how it's just kind of more gray. I don't have those extreme dark values like I do when I make this adjustment. Okay, so part of the problem here is that it might look really dark when you apply the paint when it's wet, and then as the pigment gets absorbed into the paper, it goes a little bit lighter. So you might think you have a really nice, dark, deep, rich color, but then as it dries, it absorbs into the paper and it lightens up. To counteract this general trend, I would just, and you probably are already doing this, but make sure that if you're using cake watercolors, you take your wet sponge and drip a little bit of water on all of the cakes in your palette before you start, like 15 or 20 minutes before you start. Let those cakes get really loosened up and wet, so that you're not trying to kind of scrape pigment off of a really dry and chalky watercolor cake. The other thing to do to kind of counteract this is to use tube watercolors. Tube watercolors, basically look like a tube of acrylic or oil paint. It's just much, much smaller. And you don't need as much paint to get really dark, rich values. So maybe for some of the darker values, you have a couple tubes of paint and you squeeze out a little bit of wet watercolor, which is it's just going to be much easier to get a really rich, deep, dark value in color. So if you don't want to use all wet watercolors, maybe you're going out and like the convenience of cake watercolors, maybe just having a couple of tubes of darker colors can help kind of counteract that. Okay, so that is fundamentally, I think, what's happening here is you're just dealing with one of the natural challenges of this particular medium of watercolor, and that is getting a full spectrum of value. The problems that I see here are mostly have to do with that, and more specifically with light logic, which is something I've spent a lot of time on before, but that is really the problem I see here, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time there today to kind of show you what I mean. Okay, so looking at this, composition-wise, it's fine. I do question a little bit if it needs to be such a strong emphasis on the center. I've talked in the past how reinforcing the center vertical axis isn't necessarily the best compositional decision because it's reinforcing where our eye already goes naturally. So shifting that emphasis off to one side or the other usually creates asymmetry, which tends to be a little bit more interesting, engaging, more movement, and gets us off into the sides and corners of the composition rather than just locked in on the center. So I don't know. I think if it could have been composed with more of an angle, I think you might have gotten a little bit more of a more energy, more dynamism in the composition. But it's fine. Especially this post down at the end of the pier, how it kind of creates these two symmetrical or almost symmetrical squares or rectangles in the distance. I don't know, my eye really gets caught right there. So I would either choose to de-emphasize that by making that post maybe a little bit lighter value, so there's not so high contrast, or again, perhaps shift it more over one side or the other so you don't have this symmetrical division off in the distance. It is not perfectly centered. It is off to the right just a little bit. I would go even more so in how you're composing your photograph or whatever reference you're using. Even if you're painting in person. So composition-wise, I'm fine with it. The details are really nice. I definitely know what it is, and there's a lot of really nice watercolory movement, a lot of really nice color variations and variety in the waves. What I'm missing in this has to do with volume. So all of this chop, all of this tumult, all these little facets of water reflecting colors, it doesn't resolve into volumes. So waves are made up of tiny particles of water, little droplets, right? But they comprise a larger volume of a wave. And that is often overlooked or hard to kind of pinpoint. It's the same thing that you see when you're painting trees, right? You can see all the little dots of leaves, but those leaves comprise a larger volume of leaves, and you need to get the light logic, how light is interacting with that volume. You got to get that right before you can get too caught up in the details of individual leaves or individual droplets of water. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to choose kind of a a dark brown there, and I'll show you why in just a second. And I'm going to fill that layer with this dark brown. I'm going to change it to a multiply layer for those of you that are interested in what I'm doing in Photoshop. I'm going to narrate this. And then I'm going to turn down the opacity on that a little bit. And mostly I'm doing it this way just because it gives me a little bit more control if I go too far, if I make mistakes. All right, so now what I have is I've got a semi-transparent layer of just a dark neutral color, right? It's giving me, basically I'm putting a layer of those midtones, that little dip in the histogram that I was showing you. I'm just kind of putting a blanket of that over the whole image. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to erase out using, I'm going to deselect that using an eraser. I'm going to erase out these places that I know are supposed to be light, right? They are out in the sunshine. So they are definitely going to be lighter or be exposed to more light than underneath this structure of the pier, right? Let me make that brush smaller back here. So it's a pretty safe assumption that those areas out there are going to be my lighter values. And they're all kind of even consistently the same color and again exposed to the same level of ambient sunlight. All right. Okay. So even just that made a big difference. Let me turn that layer off and back on, off and on. Right? Do you see how now this feels like it's underneath? It's in the shadow of this bridge. I've got to give some kind of indication to my viewer of the relationship between this three-dimensional object in space and how it's affecting how light is interacting with the other things in the space, right? So this is casting a shadow. So generally, your lightest light in this tumult of waves, in this choppiness down under the bridge, none of that should be as light as your lightest light out in direct sunlight, right? If it is, it's going to contradict our sense of what happens with light in three-dimensional space, right? Unless, of course, you have a secondary light source other than the sun coming in from the side. You know, there might be a reflected light of some kind, or maybe the sun isn't directly up above in the sky. But the way that you're treating these waves out in the full sunlight makes me feel like this is, and just generally the light in the sky, I don't get a real sense that there is, that the sun is rising or falling. It feels like if it's not directly maybe noon, but it is not down toward the horizon either. Okay, so now I've got a sense of that. And actually, before I do that, I'm going to go back to this and just show you, if I take all the color out and just look at light and dark, notice how all these waves in here, all of this chop, these highlights are the same value as the highlights of the waves out in the sunshine, right? That's what I'm talking about. We got to fix that because that doesn't make sense in terms of our understanding of how light interacts with objects in space. Okay? All right, so I'm going to hit cancel there, turn that back on, turn on and off. All right, so now I've fixed the problem of creating this sense that underneath this pier is away, or the pier is blocking sunlight from hitting these waves. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to erase away some of this dark layer that I added earlier. So I'm going to imagine, so the sunlight looks like these posts, you're telling me these posts are getting some light on the left side of the post. So maybe the sun is either over on this side, a little bit more on this side of the bridge, or pier, so that sun is sneaking in from the left, or maybe I've got getting some reflected light coming in from the left from bouncing off a building or whatever the case may be. But I get a little bit of bleed of light coming in from the left, which means that light would be coming in between the pillars And what I want to do is I want to give a sense for how there are these volumes that volumes of the waves, right? So as the wave hits a post, it's going to kind of go up the post a little bit, right? So I'm going to get a kind of cone shape as it wraps around the post, right? Same thing over here. So that's going to be hit by the sunlight on that side where it kind of gets bunched up along the post. And then these individual posts are going to be casting shadows, right? So I'm going to get this light coming in from the side, and I want to give a sense for the volume that is created by all of this chop as it moves around the posts in these three-dimensional objects. And maybe as it gets closer to us, it's flattening out. The waves are kind of going up on the shore and are flattening out into just basically a plane of the chop. So in this foreground, it makes more sense that there's not as much volume because the wave and chop are starting to sit down more. All right, so back here, I'm going to be getting these little highlights as they hit the volume of these different waves. And back here in the distance, looks like we've got a little bit of a gap there between posts. So maybe I'm getting a little bit of a highlight on this, the volume of that wave as it comes in and crashes in, right? So hopefully you can kind of see what I'm talking about. I'm going to turn that dark layer off and back on, off and on. And the same thing for these light values up here on the bottom side of the pier. You know, they can't be as light. Again, it's not about it being brown or blue. This can't be as light as the values of the clouds in the sky and the water outside, out from underneath this bridge or this pier. It can't be as light because that doesn't make sense, right? The light source is the sun or reflected light. And the reflected light, even if it's hitting this full force, is not going to be as light, probably, unless it's like a mirror reflection, is not going to be as light as this outside thing. So we need to make that darker as well. Okay, so that's feeling a lot better. I'm getting a sense for the volume. Once I start getting that volume, now the details, all that kind of chop information, that lovely detail information is starting to make sense because it's attached to a volume instead of just feeling like white noise. Okay. The last thing that I'm going to do here is I did not remember, this is the histogram showing me that I've got a peak here at the dark end of the spectrum because I've got all these dark values underneath the pier. I've got a valley in the midtones, which is the same as the other image, and then another small peak up here at the light end of the spectrum. So this histogram is not showing any of, or not taking into account any of what I just added. This is just purely the background thing. So I'm going to do what I just was showing you before, and I'm going to say I want what is currently this kind of almost black, this kind of lighter, dark but not completely dark brown, and I want you to make that black, and everything else is going to adjust accordingly. All right. So now I've got the full spectrum of light to dark, and you want that because light and dark contrast is how we perceive form and space. So you want to use the full spectrum. You want from white to black, right? You want that full spectrum because the more of that, the more of those extremes that you occupy, right, or the more of that range you get, the more three-dimensional it's going to feel. If everything is kind of an equal, kind of neutral gray and doesn't get to white or black, it starts to flatten out because we don't have that value contrast. All right, so I'm going to hit OK there. I'm going to turn that background off and on. You see how that's getting to be, and maybe I'll turn up the opacity on that layer just so I can accentuate what I did. All right, so that obviously gets to be too dark, but hopefully you can kind of see what it is how I've changed it when I kind of pull the opacity back on that. All right, now I'm going to add one more layer, and what I'm going to do is just hit some of the dark areas here. All right. So water, when water reflects, it's very reflective. A. So what that means is it either reflects everything or it reflects nothing. That's why you get these extremes of light, like when you get a shiny object, it's either really shiny and reflects all the light in one little specular highlight, or the metal is like almost black because it's not reflecting any light. That's what shiny means visually, right? So my suspicion is that we should be seeing, let's see, I'm going to grab, we should be seeing little moments down here in this reflection of almost black where these posts are being reflected. You know, just quite a bit darker because again, that water is going to be reflecting all of that light, and you're going to get you should be getting more high contrast in those reflections, and probably similar in the highlights. We probably get a little bit more. You get a bigger brush, a little bit more of those highlights maybe in parts of that reflection underneath. Also, these posts are casting shadows, and the little facets in this turbulence is usually going to pick up a little bit of reflection of those dark colors from the posts. Actually, no, I'm doing that wrong. So you see how this post continues, I'm going to exaggerate that, and is what is being reflected down here at the bottom. So I should be getting a little bit, some little bits of reflection of that dark post color all the way down in here, at least, you know, pretty close to this up here. Because all that turbulence, little facets of those, the faces of the facets of that choppiness, some of them are going to be facing towards that post and to be reflecting that brown color, right? So I'm going to get little spots of that, or I should be seeing some of the spots of that all the way through that reflection all the way down here into the shoreline. They probably aren't going to be as big and contrasty as that, so let me turn down the opacity on that, right? But there should be some of that in there, again, indicating to our viewer a relationship between the post and the water, right? You're going to need, you know, essentially that's what grounds what's happening in the water to the, or indicates to us the relationship between the water and the pier and these posts. So I would suspect that we'd see a little bit more of this brown color creeping into some of these areas down here again, like where that post is going to be reflected in the water choppiness. And that will give us maybe a very subtle but important indication of this reflection happening all the way down to where the water is not frothy or choppy anymore. Oops, I'm going to undo that. There we go. Okay. And I think that's it. That's all that I wanted to do here. Other than that, I think little punctuations of really dark value would help, again, just kind of anchor it at the dark end of the spectrum. You can kind of see when I turn those little spots of dark brown that should be appearing in the water, right? As that reflection happens not only in the glassy water but in the frothy as well. There should be some of that brown color reflected. And then the shadow area, I'm going to turn that on and off again. And let me, actually, I'm going to duplicate this background layer and then combine all those and just do a before and after. So before, or this is after, before, and after. All right. So that is that one. And actually, just out of curiosity, I'm going to pull up that histogram with all those layers combined now. Let's see. Oh, you see, I've got now a little bit of a hump. A little bit of a hump. More of those values are happening here in the middle of the value spectrum. Remember, this is like a bar graph. The high lines means there's a lot of dark values, right? A little peak of all these dark values and then a little peak of light values. Now we've got a peak, a little mound of midtones, which is kind of what I was talking about, is missing. Okay, so with this one, I would say a lot of the same things that I just said with the other one. We're missing a lot of the, we've got this dip in the middle of the value spectrum. If we were to pull this side down and make these darker greens go completely to the darkest value, completely to black, we're going to get more space because we're going to both extremes of the value spectrum, and value contrast is what creates volume and space, right? So you really do, I think, need to get those darker values. What I wanted to say, actually, I'm going to keep that. I'm going to pull that down so we get those dark values. I'm going to do a similar thing here where I'm going to choose kind of a mid. The colors in this are mostly kind of greens and blues. So I'm going to cover this layer with a kind of, well, it's a dark green, but when I change the opacity, it will make it kind of again, kind of occupying that. Actually, let's look at the levels. It's pretty dark there, but it's opaque. So I think I'm good. And then I'm going to make it a multiply layer, maybe make that even less opaque. Okay. So again, I'm adding in a layer of midtone, right? Because that's what's hard to get with watercolor. And then again, what I'm going to do is I know this sky, or actually this part right here looks like it's whoops. I'm going to erase. This face right here of these stairs looks like it's reflecting most of the light coming from the sun, which I assume is the light source, and maybe some of these areas down here, right? But I've got to make sure that there's not too much. I need to preserve that lightest light, that lightest extreme of the value spectrum. If I have too many things that are all equally light, well, that's probably not going to happen in a natural scenario, right? Unless everything is flat. If there's undulations, if there's form, then I'm going to get highlights and shadows, right? Things aren't just going to be equally light. So I got to protect my highlights for the things that are actually the lightest part of my image. If I have too many areas that are highlights, I'm going to most likely be disrupting the sense of light logic. Okay, so this up here, this face of the stairs reflecting all that light is definitely going to be a lot lighter than this side of this footpath, right? Or this footbridge. Because this footbridge is obviously facing away from whatever this face is facing toward, right? They're facing different directions. And this is obviously in the shade, right? On the shady side of this footpath. All right. I'm going to add another layer here, and then I'm suspecting that I would get even more of a shadow on this side, right? As it kind of curves around, I can see it does kind of like a curvy like spiral down. So I'd probably get even more of a shadow right on this side. I'm going to hit that multiply layer and change the opacity of that, so you can kind of see what I'm saying. Right? So it makes sense to me that as this curves away from the sunlight, and I don't know, maybe there's this area in the middle that should be light where the footpath goes. I'm not sure. But my suspicion is that this side would be a little bit darker, and then as it curves toward the sun, right? This is telling me which direction the sun is. As this curves around toward the sun, it's going to get lighter. All right? This is all light logic stuff, but especially with the large forms in your painting, you want to get that right. When it gets down to the minute details, you can fudge it a little bit, and people are probably not going to notice, but you got to get those large forms right. The other thing that I wanted to point out here is that you have this really strong shadow cast by the bridge onto the mountainside here, and it goes all the way down the mountain, and then all of a sudden there's no shadow anymore, right? It would be logical that that shadow would also, whoops, I'm going to choose a darker color. It would make most sense that that shadow would continue on the ground, right? As it goes down the mountainside and then flattens out on the ground, that shadow is going to continue. Probably not that dark, so I'm going to lighten that up. Right? Do you see how that works right there? So the shadow is cast on the mountainside, and I need to make sure that that shadow continues in a way that makes sense onto the surface here. And again, you can get away with a little bit of fudging on some of this stuff, but you gotta have, it's gotta make sense. Let's see. And maybe the bridge is gonna get a little bit lighter as it curves even more toward the light. Okay, so you know, I could get into more more of the same kind of thing, just walking through, getting to smaller and smaller and smaller volumes, right? Talking about how light ought to interact with those volumes, whether they be the volumes of trees or houses or whatever. But hopefully this kind of gives you an indication of kind of what I'm talking about. You did a really nice job here in this foreground wall right there. That makes a lot of sense. But there's got to be that consistency. And then let's see, on this one, I would also probably erase out some of this sky right in the background, because I know that's getting a bunch of sunlight. And, you know, down here, probably a little bit too. Okay, so I'm going to duplicate that, which I should have done in the beginning. And I'm going to combine that and do a before and after. Right? Before, after. Subtle differences, but again, just clarifying the light logic. I wanted to point out one more thing here. I'm going to change the color so it's a little bit more visible. And that is, I'm noticing, and I just want to point it out so to beware, that there are a lot of things that are starting to feel evenly. A lot of information that's starting to feel evenly distributed, like the width of these plants, how there's the space between the plants are, you know, similar, the spacing. These up here, there's a similarity in the width of these plants, the spacing in between them, similar. There's a similarity between the widths of those plants and these plants, and also the width of these windows in the background, right? And then these things in the foreground. Now you are starting to get a little bit of foreshortening without how these are treated, but I'm just starting to pick up a consistency in how you are spacing visual information, and that tells, or it throws up a red flag in me that tells me that you're kind of on autopilot on these things, right? Even if these plants were planted evenly spaced at the same time, so they're all the same size and height or whatever, there is still more than likely going to be foreshortening in our relationship to them, right? They're going to be going off in the distance, so their spacing and size are going to be getting more squished as they are foreshortened, right? It is very unlikely that I would get as much sameness as I see here, right, in the widths of things. What is probably more likely is that is kind of, you tend to default to that size, that scale of things, when, you know, when you're just kind of making a shorthand of what you're seeing, right? It's more of like a note than it is trying to represent what you're actually seeing. And I would just be aware of that. When you are generalizing, right, you don't have to do every little detail of every little building or plant, but when you're generalizing this visual information, that you're seeing out in nature, recognize that we all have a tendency to start to evenly distribute that visual information, right? And our viewer is going to pick up on that because it's not very natural. Things don't really occur that evenly and consistently out in the world. So just watch out for that, I guess, is kind of my warning. And besides that, and I didn't really talk too much in the beginning about the composition. What a lovely subject matter. I mean, this is a really cool, like clean, sharp edge shape, and the way that it curves around and is such a dominant compositional element there is just really interesting. And then you've got this big, dark shape on the right, a lot of movement, these strong diagonals, and then this diagonal down here, these large divisions in not just the bridge, but in the landscape, right? You've got these kind of groupings of different kinds of visual information, and the mountains dividing the sky in the background. So even though you do have a tremendous amount of really lovely, interesting, engaging detail, you also did a really good job of the foundation part of the image, of the composition, right? You've got your large, medium, small divisions of space. You've got your active diagonal lines, and there's just a really, there's just a lot of really nice dynamic energy in there, and a lot of nice high contrast. So subject matter wise, fantastic. I do not worry about your ability to get the details. Remember, the answer, I mean, when we sense that something isn't quite right in a painting, often the impulse is to want to add more detail. I must not be getting the details right. When really, most often, the mistakes are happening at a much larger scale or more foundational scale. And if anything, we need to take away some of the detail so we can see what's happening on that more foundational level, on the larger scale, right? How whole volumes, the whole bridge, the whole wave, instead of individual droplets, how those whole volumes are interacting with light in space and other objects in that illusionistic space. So being able to kind of blur your eyes a little bit and get rid of all the detail information so you can see how light is interacting with those larger volumes often is the answer. And you don't need to add more. You need to fix those larger relationships. All right, so I'm going to actually go back over to Facebook and see if I ever showed up. Nope, never showed up. So hopefully I'm going to look at the comments. Do I have any comments on Facebook? 2 are watching. Okay. Well, I might be one of those watching. So maybe, oh, okay. I got 1 thumbs up. Well, hopefully this makes it to the artist who submitted the image. I will post this to Facebook later on as soon as I can download it from YouTube. I hope this was helpful. And if you have images that you would like to share, I would love to take a look at them, see what you're up to. There is no qualification as far as who submits images. I welcome any work. The one thing that I'm hopeful, though, is that the work that you submit or send me images of is work that you're either currently working on, works in progress, or recently finished. Because I'd like to keep it to this kind of momentum of what we're working on right now. I think there's energy in that and inspiration for everyone in that. So send me images of what you're up to. If there's something in particular you want me to respond to or that you're struggling with, I'd be happy to address that specifically, or you can just send it to me and I'll say what I'm going to say. I hope everybody's doing well. Take a look at the podcast. That's www.dabbleon.com/podcast. And I will be back again next Thursday at 11 a.m. Los Angeles time. I look forward to talking to you then. All right, everybody. Have a good week. And get out there and go make a painting, make a mess. Bye.